So our guest today is Dr. Fio Dossetto. She's a content marketing manager at Aula, editor-in-chief of Contentfolks, a brilliant newsletter, by the way. You should definitely subscribe. I guess we get to that later. And also the former senior editor at HotJar. Welcome to the show, Fio.
Thank you.
So let's jump right in. I read in your LinkedIn bio, at some point it says like managed 15 freelancers, 2 VAs, 6 guest authors, and 1 full-time in-house writer. That sounds like a pretty big content operation. Can you talk a bit about like what, how you manage like a team of content writers, like what is outsourced, what is in-house, and how these numbers came about?
Yes, I can do all of that, but I will start with a caveat that those 15 freelancers did not all happen at the same time, or my head would have exploded probably. But yeah, so let me just give you a quick summary of what the team looked like. So the team was very small. At HotJar, we were 2 people. There was me and Louis Grenier, who's the host of a podcast called Everyone Hates Marketers, you may or may not know about. And we were 2 people in a relatively small marketing team in a relatively small company that was fully bootstrapped. So we had no investors. And so the amount of people that we could bring on the team was limited. The kind of resources that we had was limited. And so we had to play smart with what we were given. And initially it was just me and him, and anything that was being written pretty much was me writing it at one point or another with input from the team. But then obviously that wouldn't scale as needed, because there is only one of me and there's a lot of content opportunities around. And so we started looking into bringing freelancers in to help us with the work. And so, yeah, we had these 15 freelancers over the course of, I want to say maybe a year or so. We also used content agencies. We then needed to rely on VAs, because the more people you bring on, the more your overhead keeps growing. And so you need to keep track of everything that's going on, and there's a lot of admin that is required, and you do inevitably need help. And then guest authors are, the people that wanted to contribute to the HotJar blog, etc. We then at some point made the decision to actually stop bringing freelancers in and instead hire for an in-house person. So that happened twice in the course of my tenure at HotJar. And mostly because the kind of content that we were practicing, and we can probably talk about it later, had a very specific product aspect to it. And it was really hard to find freelancers who would competently, and I'd say also happily write about a product that perhaps they didn't really know about, or they didn't really know the ins and outs of the product really well. And so we made this decision to invest time bringing somebody in and train them up and teach them content the way we were doing it and practicing. And then this person was obviously amazing. And then now she's there running the content team, and she's going through the whole having freelancers, having in-house people. So it's happening again. So that was pretty much the story behind those big numbers that you saw there.
Awesome. Thanks for shedding some light onto that. So how do I have to imagine this? So you are in the position at HotJar, the only person writing content, and then like, what was your thinking around outsourcing? Like, what were the first steps? Like, what kind of content did you outsource, and how did you outsource?
Yes. For that, you need to know that we made a specific decision to focus on SEO as our primary distribution method for content. And we decided to focus on the blog really as, I'm going to say, the blog and written resources, long form resources as our primary way of creating and distributing content. So what we started outsourcing first were the kind of content where you'd probably call it top of the funnel relatively top of the funnel and high volume keywords, where you had to just come in and define a more generic aspect or topic that related to our business. So for example, HotJar is a tool that offers surveys. One type of survey that we offered is, well, they still do, I'm just not there. One type of survey that they still offer is Net Promoter Score. And so we decided to write a guide to Net Promoter Score. And that's the kind of top of the funnel content that we felt comfortable outsourcing, not in the sense that we created the brief, gave it to a freelancer, and then we forgot about it until they got back to us, but because we had a pretty good system whereby we would ourselves in-house interview experts on a topic, use the transcripts, create a brief, give this to the freelancers with clear guidelines, and they would just take the transcript, take the content, do their own research on top, and then deliver. So it was very much a collaborative process whereby they received guidance and then they could elaborate and build on top as they needed. And we found that worked really well.
That's awesome. I think it's in content, there's so much about processes, and I love what you just said with the process that you apparently had with experts. So can you explain a bit further? So how did that work? Was it that kind of a podcast situation where you would afterwards distribute the audio as well from that interview, or was it like how did that come about? Can you make an example?
Yeah, actually, it wasn't about a podcast so much as we would find somebody who knew what they were talking about, and then we would reach out, and we would call them our experts. They were just people who knew their things, and they had been there, done that, and they were somewhat recognized in the industry for what they were doing. So we would just simply reach out to them and ask them if they wanted to participate in this call with us that we would then turn into a blog post. And of course, we would credit them 100%. So we never pretended that this wasn't anything that they had done. And people responded really nicely to it. We never, these transcripts really exist for the blog post. I suppose we could have turned them into podcasts, perhaps, but we didn't, because we were just really laser focused on this one format of written blog post, and the interview was just the means to the end, which was publishing a piece.
So then how do I have to imagine this interview? Like, would you outline it in a way beforehand? Like, would you say like, okay, so these are the 5 things we need to talk about, like in this order, and then you would kind of ask the questions and that would turn into a transcript, or how do I have to imagine that?
Yeah, so I can give you a sort of step-by-step overview. Firstly, we would obviously, again, SEO being our primary method, we would do our research and see what was already ranking, understand search intent and all of that. We would create a top-level outline of the content piece, and then we would include all the kind of information that we really wanted to get from the person we were interviewing. So after interviewing the potential interviewee, we would, reach out and let them know what we had in mind, set a date, and run the interview. And then the kinds of questions, I can give you some examples of the kinds of questions that we would ask, but usually it would be questions that, if you get 30 minutes with an expert, you better make each minute count. So you don't waste their time by asking the obvious stuff that you can find just by Googling. You want to ask things like, how would you define this topic for a beginner? What's something that non-experts believe about this topic that they're wrong about? In your experience, what's the most common reason people fail to succeed with this topic? How do you overcome the most common roadblocks or pain points, etc.? So you have all this information that comes from your subject matter expert, SME, and then you create a transcript, you give it to your writers, freelancer, in-house, whoever they are, and then they can match these answers to the outline that you were using before, and the results are really quite good. note, this is not a shortcut. So this is actually not the fastest or swiftest way to create content, because obviously as soon as you start looping in another person, the timeline expands. You need to coordinate calendars, you need to find time, then you need to find a freelancer, but I think it's worth it. You can create pretty much anything you need content-wise and have good authority show through. And this is what we decided to do for any topic where we felt we didn't have enough expertise to do it ourselves.
I love that, because why I love it is and I said this a couple of times on this podcast as well, I feel like what's happening at the moment is like that a lot of the content out there that is shown on page 1 on Google is written by content marketers and kind of SEO optimized, and oftentimes not by people who've actually practiced what they're kind of preaching in a blog post. And what happens then because of that is people are taking these like 7 steps to whatever and are thinking and then they think that this is basically the best practice in the industry, and so kind of getting someone on and having the sort of humility that we might not be the expert, and let's get someone on who's actually practicing it. I love that. So that's why I actually wanted to get a little bit deeper in there. Cool. And so then the interesting part as well about what you said before is, okay, so then you hired some freelancers who would do some of the SEO work as well. So they would or they would just write and kind of organize.
They would just write. For the SEO part, we worked with an agency, and then we had in-house knowledge in the form of myself. So I would also do the briefs and the research, etc. myself. No, the writers were hired to do the hard part of putting everything together.
Okay, and then the next part that you mentioned is VAs, which I think is super interesting. So then you hired VAs to steer the whole process. Like, what would the VA actually do?
Actually, the VA wouldn't steer the process so much as they would help us get things done. Here's a practical example. Once we had all the stuff written and the illustration, etc., the page needs building. And usually, because we were using a rather complex CMS, usually that would take anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes. We're building one blog post. Now, at the frequency at which we were publishing, that could easily take 5 or 6 hours of your week just in that, which I think, it's valuable work. And we were really grateful that there were people who were not just able, but also really happy to do it for us. I wasn't a big fan of doing it. So I felt that outsourcing it was probably the best thing. So I could invest my time in stuff that I was good at and happy to do. Of course, that came later on, once we had proved that content was viable and valuable to the business. For the first year, it doesn't matter. We just built everything ourselves regardless, because the budget was what it was. We needed first to prove that this was worth investing in before going all in with VAs, etc. So we had a learning curve there as well.
I think this is an important point as well, because like if you outsource something you haven't done yourself before, it's really tough to steer the process, right? Because you don't actually know all the steps that are involved.
And also you don't know the pain points or the bottlenecks, and then you can't really help the VA or so I'm a big advocate of doing it myself up until the point where there is a good process, and then I can let that go, knowing what's required, and having been there, done that myself before.
So you mentioned then in the beginning you started doing a lot of top of funnel content, like you mentioned, like the definitive guide on NPS or whatever. And then you were shifting, as I understood that correctly, in I think a webinar that you've given, you kind of started shifting more towards what you now call, I don't know if you always called it that way, but what you now call kind of product-led content, which I'm not even sure if we need to put it in like the bottom of funnel. I guess it's also for existing customers and maybe even upgrading or retention. So can you mention what happened there? So you did all the top of funnel content that seemed to work. And then what was the next kind of step after that, like the evolution?
Yes. So I'll tell you what happened. Actually, and you're quite right to point this out. It's easy to call this product-led content now. When we were doing it, we were not naming it. We were just calling it content and taking a specific approach. There wasn't actually truly a before and after moment. So even in what you just called, top of the funnel guide, our guiding principle was we want to show our product in action as much as possible, regardless of what we're writing about. And so even if you take what you could probably argue that because of HotJar using surveys, NPS sits somewhere in the middle, top-ish of a traditional funnel if you want. But even for that, our main goal was to show how you could do some of this stuff using the product. And this is what I call product-led content, is essentially finding ways to weave a narrative or, let the story hinge around the product and showcase the product in action so that people perceive it at any point as the solution to the problem or as the means that they can use to solve the problem, do the job that they need to do, etc. So, sorry, I was just trying to think, but yeah, this really did apply across. If you want, you can call it top, middle funnel. I actually like to think of the funnel didn't really matter anymore at that point. We were picking content opportunities based on how much of the product we could actually talk about, and that could work for acquisition. That could also work for retention. As I like to say, just because you have customers already doesn't mean that they know every single facet of your product or they're using it to its full potential. And so this kind of content might just help them figure out that there is something that they haven't done, they haven't thought about, and now they know they can do it and they can go and try it. So that's the sort of product-led approach that we took, that we now call product-led approach. And back then it was just how much of HotJar can we put into this blog post without it looking, salesy or artificial or fake. That's just, the distinction is very clear. We just wanted to show the product as part of a solution, present it as the de facto solution to something at any point where somebody had something to do.
I mean, something that I found both, I think, do you also work with Ahrefs, or you've at least taken them as an example? I'm not sure.
I have collaborated with Ahrefs as well. Yes, I've written some stuff for them too.
So what I've seen both for HotJar, but also for Ahrefs, which is an SEO tool, that it never felt forced necessarily, because you can obviously also plug your product in your content, and it's like, hey, by the way, that's our product and that's what it's for. But especially with Ahrefs content, I almost felt like drawn to try it out. Like the content was so interwoven with the product that they basically gave me not only the kind of step-by-step guide on how to do something, but then also the tool to it. And so why wouldn't I just use it with the tool?
And in fairness, all the credits absolutely goes to Ahrefs. I simply looked at what they were doing and tried to replicate it at HotJar with Fluey. But they are the perfect go-to example. So if you end up on the Ahrefs blog, you're guaranteed to see the tool in action, regardless of the topic. They always find a way of adding the tool in and adding some value and giving you the feeling of, oh, if I'm ever interested in doing whatever this is how it's done. And so if you are, if you're starting out in content marketing or SEO, you might read 5-10 Ahrefs articles before you're even ready. But at that point, you've seen it so much that you actually, I think you actually have a feeling that you know how to use it because you're familiar with the interface. you've seen plenty of examples of how it's done, which is much easier if you think about than just jumping into the dark and subscribing to a tool that you've never seen before, and somehow the website tells you it will work for you, and you sort of have to cross your finger and hope it's true, but you don't know what happens after you sign up. Like, you have no idea what this thing looks like. It's a very different way of thinking about and showcasing a product.
So what do you think is needed to go this approach? I mean, I guess you need to have a certain complexity of product features that you can show. Like what?
I mean,
where does? Yeah.
Sorry, not really. I think if you have a product, and by the way, we're talking product, but it may well be a service. If you're doing something that in some way people are using and getting value from, that's the kind of stuff you can showcase. It doesn't matter if you have 5 or 50,000 features, as long as you find a way of showcasing the part of it that people are using, and you're showing how they can use it, what for, what kind of results it brings. You can get started with like the smallest products, I think.
Interesting. Like I'm also thinking a lot, like, so oftentimes, especially products that where the first point of contact is basically a demo, where and you might not want to actually jump in with a salesperson and then have a demo, right? But if you can first kind of figure out like what your solution to your current problems, and then you see it constantly in the context of a tool that you might use or switch to at some point, that's quite powerful, because like a lot of tools are maybe not self-serve and you cannot sign up yourself, but you kind of need someone to come on. Have you seen that done in kind of enterprise products as well?
I haven't seen it done, mostly because I haven't needed a tool, and I haven't actually gone out of my way, to be honest, to look for other examples. But what I've seen done is, a lot of the time, I find that B2B companies publish useful guides and blog posts, and they don't usually talk about their product or service until the very conclusion. So you read this entire thing, and then you get to the conclusion, and you get a paragraph that tells you, for the last 10 years, we've helped businesses do X, Y, and Z. And if you want to know more, just, here's our contacts, and contact our dedicated team or whatever. That's, I think, not enough. Or I mean, obviously it works for some people because they're still in business, but that may not be enough. It's quite, as I was saying, it's quite a jump in the dark. Now compare that to the same thing, but you've written a long guide, and throughout it, you've added screenshots, you've added examples, etc. Once you get to the conclusion, at the very least, there's a slightly better sense of what this thing even is and what it looks like. And so maybe the step is not as scary as it normally is.
Because I mean, like, I feel like, especially with content marketers, like a lot of content marketers have kind of an ethos, right? They're like this, like, I'm not selling, like I'm providing value, like in a way, and maybe like actually this framework or like this term of product-led content is a bit less scary because you're still providing value. And you're actually also helping the business or the customers getting more familiar with the product without really selling, right?
Yeah, you're right. I think, it's quite possible that content teams think that they're not allowed to showcase products in your typical blog post, or that we are afraid of coming across as too salesy, and the risk is true. Obviously, we can all see when we're trying to really force a product into a piece where it shouldn't be, but you're forced to do it. But on the other hand, you can also think about it. So you have a solution to a problem. You can competently write about the solution, and you have a product that can help. Why not show it? Aren't you actually doing a disservice to your people by giving them 75% of the answer and then not getting to the 100%, which is showing the product? So this is how I like to think about it. And if you start thinking about it, then it is not salesy. It's really valuable if you have something that people can look at, familiarize themselves with, imagine themselves using way before they get in touch with you. If it gives them the confidence, why not?
I love that. And so, like, if I'm not doing that today, I guess there's two avenues from here. One is like, is there a way to use my existing content and kind of make it product led ready, I guess, or how you want to call that? And then the second avenue is like, everything I'm creating from now on, like, how do I think about creating a more like product-led, or creating with a more product-led approach in mind?
Okay.
So if we start with the first one, like updating, what would you like? Is it possible? I guess, do you need to rewrite the whole thing, or like what would you recommend someone who's like looking at their backlog, doing maybe a little content audit, and then
yeah, so this is a podcast, people can't see it, but I've been nodding along from the moment you asked if this is doable for content that already exists. And yes, and in fact, this is probably what I would recommend for somebody just getting started. If you already have content, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, or forget about everything you've done and start again. No, you can just audit the content that you already have. And what I would do is identify some of the pieces that maybe work well by whichever metric you want to define success. So maybe they're ranking well, or maybe they're bringing traffic, maybe they have a lot of backlinks, whatever it is. And if in this piece of content you're writing or talking about something, and you know for a fact that people can do that particular thing with your content, with your products, that's the point where you add a paragraph, or you add a screenshot, maybe you add a box, call it editor's tip, call it pro tip, call it whatever you want, and just show how that thing is practically done with your product. And then you move on. So if there are more opportunities in this piece, you do it again. And if they're not, that's fine. Product-led content doesn't have to be this massive thing. It may amount literally to 4 lines, a screenshot and a caption in a blog post. But if you do it consistently over the course of 10, 20, 50 pages, if you have them, then it becomes a more coherent unity. And then people who go from one piece to the other keep seeing the same thing, or the same interface, or some examples of both. And then, that's how I would get started.
No, I think it's important to say, like, it's product-led content in the end is just like a term in order to describe what we're trying to do, but it doesn't mean like there's like this huge elaborate thing. Nevertheless, though, like, if I am, how does my thinking shift when I am going product-led first for new content? So what's the different approach? Is there a different approach of how you like go at content?
There is a slightly different approach here. Yes. So the way you prioritize content might change, because before you're probably prioritizing content by potential traffic or whatever other metric.
Right.
Here, you're also bringing your ability to talk about the product in the mix, and you're prioritizing places where you can talk about the product, and your product is an irreplaceable solution. We're going back to Ahrefs for a second. Ahrefs did this really useful course back in 2017 called Blogging for Business, where they introduced, us who were watching it to their method for doing content. And they had this prioritization scale from 0 to 3, where 0 is a topic where you have no way to mention the product. 1, the product can be mentioned in passing. 2, the product helps, but it's not essential. And 3, the product is the go-to or the irreplaceable solution for the problem. And so when you're starting to think about product-led content for pieces moving forward, you want to gravitate towards pieces with a score of 3 or 2, which allow you to talk about the product and present it. And you might deprioritize pieces with 0 and 1. importantly, the pieces with a value of 0 and 1 are also probably the ones that are likely to get you the most traffic.
Right.
This is an interesting trade-off, and this is where you need to have your strategic hat on and go back to the business or whoever is measuring results and saying, are we prepared to make this trade-off? So are we prepared to have slightly less traffic if this means better targeted and people who are closer to our product and they can convert? And hopefully the people in charge will see what you're trying to do and say yes. Some other time they will say no. And so you are going to have to find a smart way of doing both. So keep doing what you're doing, but then, weave the product in as much as you can in other and smaller pieces, and then measure their success and prove or disprove your hypothesis. This is a viable way forward.
Yeah, I feel in a lot of cases there is this trade-off to be made. Like I'm closely following companies who are on-gating their content and like how they kind of talk about the process of on-gating, because there is a period where you will be able to report less MQLs because there's less leads, and then there's less just people taking any kind of engagement, so you cannot give them the points so they become MQLs. And so in this period, it's a scary period, right? Because you're making a bet for something, and you kind of go out and say like, hey, this is something I really like to try, and then you kind of open yourself to this kind of criticism. And I think it's the same, maybe a little slightly less scary here, because it's kind of more on the traffic side. But still, I mean, I feel like making these bets is also something that marketers should do more often, and not only follow like the metrics that they're told.
Yeah, and I have two points to that. The first one is, yes, it is a scary thing. And in fact, this is also why I advise to not just jump in and go in, from 0 to 100 on day 2. Just take your time. There's content that you already have. Do some of that. And then maybe if, the content you're planning for the next quarter, maybe ring fence 20% of it to experiment with and use the rest to grow, so you don't tank your efforts, because then it's also entirely counterproductive. If you can't prove that what you're doing is working, then you're kind of done in a sense. But at the same time, and that's why I was talking about putting on a strategy hat, I think content marketers who want to level up, or who are interested in leveling up, actually, we might need to start thinking more about business in a holistic sense. So there is a concept of vanity metrics, and sometimes we don't question it, but traffic can be a vanity metric. If you're bringing millions of people and nobody takes action, that million of people doesn't mean anything to the business. So it's sometimes, you think you're having good results, but actually when you go back with your strategy hat, you're thinking, hang on a minute, this traffic is not resulting in anything. What am I doing wrong? I think whenever we as marketers ask ourselves these questions, or we are asked the question, that's where the fun is, and that's where the growth is, and that's where you can actually say, look, maybe traffic is not the be all and end all. In fact, maybe we can stand to lose a little bit of traffic if it turns out that the people we bring are actually really qualified and they really want a solution, and we have the solution for them, as opposed to, all this other noise that we're bringing on. And it's not resulting in business growth.
How have you kind of, either that's for like your boss or for yourself, put some measuring posts around whether the product-led content worked? Was it like an adoption of certain features, or sort of, could you clearly see it tracing back to increased revenue? Like how were you either you yourself or like reporting wise thinking about it?
Yeah, so the team started off measuring traffic because that was the easiest and most convenient way to see if what we were doing even made sense. And once we saw that the traffic was coming in, we then graduated to a new level and we started looking at signups. And then from them, we started looking at marketing qualified leads. And so as the organization grew in maturity, so did the tracking and the reporting. And so we could see stuff that we literally couldn't see before because nobody was tracking anything at that point. And we were tracking both first touch and last touch signups and comparing them. So there is vast amount of data that is missing between these two touch points, but you could somewhat make an argument and see what people were doing. And then later on, we also tried to do some cohort analysis on customer behavior. So you could take your customers and see if people who are exposed to a specific piece of content or groups, group of pages, etc., behave differently when it comes to upsells or, I don't know, churn on the opposite, compared to people who haven't. I think we didn't really go into super detail because there is also a risk that you're trying to measure everything and then you end up kind of paralyzed by all the data and the data is imperfect anyway. But I think as long as you're getting signals and you have a directional understanding that what you're doing is going well, then you're in a good place.
Did that also actually, did you see any effects on the content distribution side? Because I mean, when you talk about your own product, I guess in like in an article, like did you see any like less sharing because it was kind of branded content in a way? Like did you see any effects there?
I didn't see that effect because we were actually not really measuring that in the first place. So insofar as we focused on SEO, really, and then everything else was, a nice to have on top. But what I will say is that we wrote some pretty comprehensive guides to topics like UX design or customer journey mapping, etc. And they got good natural backlinks without us doing much for them, to be honest. And again, the point goes back to what we were talking about before. We always made sure to bring on subject matter experts so that actually the way we show the product in action, it was always in the context of getting something done and seeing how a pro was doing it. So it's not just, a random screenshot of how you can do it, but sometimes maybe there is a write-up of what the screenshot meant or what the person who was doing the particular thing did using that piece of functionality. So I think, to your question, I don't think that taking this approach had any negative impact on our growth.
That's good to hear. I think what if we actually stay with the topic of content distribution, what I see a lot when we work with companies or even in my own career, there's a lot of focus on content creation. There's a lot of content and people just keep creating. And there is very little focus. I think it's shifting, but there's very little focus on the content distribution strategy. And then, as you say, like, for example, with HotJar, I guess the distribution was mostly doing through search engines. But I have seen, and I would like to dig deeper there in your newsletter that I teased at the beginning. And maybe we can actually, how do people find the newsletter? So we actually plug it in right here because that's how I found what I'm about to say.
So this is a wonderful question. Like you just said, I did not start off with the distribution method at all. Yeah. So I'm guilty of doing the same thing as you did. I just thought I had some ideas to share and I wanted to share them. And then a few people that I know followed me, and then some people amplified. So what I didn't think about, but I probably should have, was doing something like this, you know, talking to you or talking to other experts, exchanging ideas and getting mentioned. And that naturally has brought people to my newsletter, which I hadn't really even thought about. So I'm going to say I did a better job at thinking about distribution for HotJar than I did at thinking for my own project. But
that's often the case, though. I feel. So
yeah.
so how do people find it? It's content.
It's contentfolks.substack.com. Even
Okay,
then,
cool.
I just chose Substack, and to be perfectly candid, it's because after spending almost 4 years at HotJar using MailChimp, I just wanted something super simple. I did maybe 15 minutes of research. There's probably better providers out there. Like, I honestly really, now that I hear myself saying these things, I think I should have had a better strategy from the start. But yeah, so it's Substack. It could be literally anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I also use Substack for mine, and it's just because of that. Like, I just want to go out, write, and I don't need to think about anything else. I could do like crazy ConvertKit stuff, you know. In fact, maybe I do at some point, but not right now. So, and in one of the newsletters, I think it was a fairly recent one, you were talking about this findability / relevance matrix. Can you kind of paint a picture of what that looks like and why it's important?
Yes, I'll paint the picture. And again, I will not use myself as an example because we just proven I'm not following my own my own thinking. But rightly so, as you said, a lot of the time, we content marketers are so caught up in the frenzy of creating content that we forget a few important questions. And the first question is this really relevant to the people, you know, that we're doing it for? And the second is, how are they going to find it? So sometimes instead of jumping in, it's better to take a step back. There is an approach I've seen on multiple teams as a sort of build it and they will come kind of approach, whereby you're just throwing content out there and you're imagining or assuming that people will find it. They won't, because you haven't thought about where they look for things and what they want. And so this findability relevance matrix was really a way for me to think through some of these issues. So now when I approach things, I like, instead of starting from the content, I actually like to take 3 steps back and ask myself specific questions. For example, what industry relevant publications do customers follow? How they go about finding solutions to their problems? What communities are they in? Who do they respect in their industry? How did they first hear about their business? This kind of information tells you A, what they're interested in, but also B, where they go for it. And when you put together this information, that's where you need to be. And that's the kind of stuff that you need to write about. And the big caveat to all of this is that this applies really well to content that is designed to convert. And by conversion, I mean anything that really directly impacts a business. So like product signups, purchases, expansions, etc. Because if you're doing high level thinking, or what we may want to call thought leadership, that doesn't really quite apply. So you can do it. You can get people to you by virtue of yourself having a strong opinion. It doesn't really work with content that you want people to take action on, and the action has to do with your business.
How do you then, if you know all of this about like where kind of the watering holes are of your industry, I guess, or the water cooler, how do you think about distribution at the start before you create a piece of content? Do you think about it afterwards, like where it's going to show up? So like how does one go from like a creation mindset into more of a hybrid, like creation and distribution mindset?
Yeah, I think you do. Again, with the caveat that we chose SEO as a distribution method because we had evidence that the type of customers that we were trying to attract, if faced with a problem, they will go to Google.
Yeah, I think
first.
that's a really important point. Yeah.
And that's where we made our bet. But had we thought that customers, for whatever reason, really went on Reddit or really wanted YouTube, that would have changed the entire strategy at that point, because maybe you've written the ultimate guide to the Net Promoter Score. Turns out nobody who cares about it reads about it. They all wanted a 10-minute video. And so now you just created a lot of content that is not going to do much for you. So I think knowing this kind of information and knowing where people are might not necessarily dictate, but certainly direct your content efforts. So then you pick the formats, you pick the specifics later, not before.
And I think that's where, like, so what I see a lot is that a company, especially larger companies, like say 50 employees plus, I guess in the startup world that's larger, they then start like being on all the channels, right? Because now they got Series B funding, and now they can go crazy on all the channels just because they can. So like just actually thinking about 1, 2, or max 3 channels that you can actually serve and serve well, and I guess customize your content to, because I feel like every channel is different. And what I see a lot is like people are like this kind of atomizing content. You have one piece of content, and then you make it into 1,000 different pieces, and then you put it everywhere, which in theory I like, but then every channel has like there's a lot of depths. Every channel has a lot of depths, I feel, and oftentimes it's just kind of plastered all over the place, which then I guess is not a distribution strategy either.
No, it's more of a spray and pray approach, I think. Look, I'll be very honest. I come from a HotJar was a small company. It was bootstrapped. We could not even if we had wanted to, we couldn't have been on all the channels. We just didn't have the resources, the time, and the people. So we made a bet. And we made a bet that focusing on 1, 2 maximum and being constant and, almost single-minded about it, and also patient about it, was the strategy that would have won in the long term. And it did. Now, the company has since grown, and it's probably twice the size that it was last year. They might be close to 200. With that might come different needs. I actually don't know what that looks like. I don't know what a content team looks like in a company that big. So it's also possible that they're now finding new platforms. And if the people that you're trying to reach are on these new platforms, go for it. Even though I would also caution about the sort of shiny object syndrome that I see around marketing for a while. So my favorite example from this year was in February, everybody was talking about Clubhouse. And it looked like if you were not
such a good example,
just stop whatever you're doing, pivot by 150%, just do everything in Clubhouse, you were just going to be left behind. And now it's June and nobody's talking about Clubhouse. So that's a good example. Sometimes things like these work. Most of the time they don't. And perhaps if you'd stayed focused where you were before, you wouldn't have wasted your time. Also, maybe you haven't, in that you've learned a few valuable lessons about Clubhouse. I don't know, but still, that's
I mean, I feel like using 80% of your time consistently on one thing and kind of doubling down on one thing, like maybe you did with HotJar with SEO, and then allowing 10-20% of your time for experimentation. Like, I think there's nothing wrong necessarily with like trying stuff out on Clubhouse or another platform that comes up that just interests you and you want to kind of dabble in it. It's just if your CEO already all of a sudden finds that you need to be on Clubhouse, you shouldn't probably shift your whole strategy around.
Yes. Exactly.
Is your point.
I think yours is I might even use a 70-30 split. I think a former manager of mine, and I'm going to misquote him terribly, but he liked to say he thought about content properties as an investment portfolio, and you want some assets that are relatively low risk, and the majority of them is there, so you can rest safe, and then the rest of it, maybe the 30 or the 20 or the whatever, is there for experimentation, and you go in knowing you might get burnt and you might lose something, but at the same time you might learn some valuable lessons in there. So as long as you have a split and you don't just completely pivot every 3 months for the new fad or for the new platform, I think you're in a good place.
Right, because I mean, you also want not to be complacent, right? And I mean,
yes,
it's also just motivating, like, to try new stuff and like not constantly hammering on the same thing. So I think
also,
like,
sorry, just to add, much like it's also quite possible that your customer profile shifts over the course of 2 or 3 years, and maybe what was true 2 years ago is not necessary right now, which is also why I think as content marketers, another thing that we could do with doing more of is customer research and actually talking to customers, because things change, the market evolves, people's priority change, etc. And so it's important to keep in touch with the people that you're doing the thing for.
It's funny because so I was doing content marketing, and then I switched companies, and the company their product was in the user research space. I had absolutely, as a marketer at the time, that was in 2016, I had absolutely nothing to do with user research. I didn't barely know what it was, to be honest with you. But there the CEO was kind of, hey, like, why don't you just have conversations with the customer? I'm like, what? Like, I'm doing content here. Like, why? And for me, in this first round where I actually did 10 interviews with, I kind of split it between potential customers that were not interested in the solution, potential customers that were interested and sitting in the pipeline, and then 3 customers. That just opened my eyes, because they just told me their challenges, and I could start writing about their challenges, and then naturally they would Google their challenges, I guess. In some, for us, it was also SEO. So they would Google their challenges, and I was like, oh, okay. So now I had so much more confidence once I did some form of like customer research, user research around content. And I don't think in the marketing space I guess it's increasing, but it's not the common way of like putting together a content calendar, I guess.
Yeah. So here's a bit of a story about my career that I don't think anybody should replicate, but it's a good example. So I was a content marketer for years, and then I worked in the UX department with content. And then I realized that I actually didn't really know much about user research, much like you said. So I took a temporary but voluntary detour from content marketing to become a UX researcher. And then I spent 1.5 years just completely changing jobs just to see what that meant. Boy, was that a learning curve that I wish every marketer could have in one way or another, because I spent hundreds of hours in the lab interviewing people, looking at how they went about finding solutions to their problems. It was amazing. And I think actually it's such a valuable thing to do for a marketer. So whoever is listening to this podcast right now, like forget about product-led content. That's all good. But like the first thing you need to do is actually talk to your customers, prospective, existing, just get on a Zoom call or whatever format, and talk to the people you're doing this for. It is such an eye-opening experience. And I think it really changes the way that you think about content marketing from then on. And the more you do, the more you really do start understanding what it means to do content for an audience, as opposed to content for the sake of it.
Yeah, I mean, I can second that 100%. Like it's interesting because I got into the UX space this way, right? And then our customers were user researchers. So, and and I kind of found that that what changed for me was I was stop writing about like stuff that everybody in the company thought, or like their opinion was that we should write about, but it was actually what the customer told us that their challenges are. And then I didn't at the time, and I think when you marry the two, when you have the product-led content married with user research, it's super powerful, because then you can, on top of that, you know what challenges to write about, you also can then write about like challenges that are give the 3 points that you mentioned before on the Ahrefs scale, right? And then it's even more powerful. So
and also, sorry, if I may add it to complement this, when you talk to customers, not only do you hear about challenges, you also hear about success. And that's great, because then you can create a lot of other content that speaks to how you can successfully do more with or do better at. And you can also use their experience. And in fact, if your customers are as nice as mine were, they will maybe even give you access to their own screenshots, and they will show you how they were using the platform. In our case, a lot of from these calls that I had with customers, out of that came articles where they sent me screenshots of the service that they launched, or the results that they had, the heat maps that they used. And that was that's just such it's the culmination of all things that are good about content, because you got authority, but you got people's proof, you got the product in place, it's optimized for SEO, it's customer focused. It's just great. It just makes me so happy to be a content marketer sometimes when you see all these things come together in a piece, and then it can actually make a difference. It's great.
Yeah, and it just increases your confidence in like that what you're doing actually helps the business, which is not always as a content marketer, you're not always regarded as like someone who is contributing to revenue and actually helping the business. I feel like oftentimes like more of a cost center, depending on the company. That's kind of how it's looked at.
But I think you are, and you as a content marketer should be empowered by the knowledge that the content you do can drive growth and can have a good impact on the business. And don't let people tell you otherwise. You can prove it. And then, yes. Sorry, I feel very strongly about this point.
No. I mean, I'm 100%. It took me a little while to kind of find the confidence that I can actually go out and say like, and it really changed with user research, because now I was kind of sure, because I heard the customer saying, and I mean, after like 5-6 calls, like you hear the patterns, like the objections, the challenges, the wins, which I think is a good point. Like the wins, and so your boss cannot say their opinion when or it has less weight when you heard like 6 people talking about the opposite, right?
100%.
So so before we wrap up, like one thing, if you put your strategy hat on, like you said, and we talked a bit about user research and stuff like that as well now, when you come into a new company and you are the content lead, and there is already content there, like how do you go about like auditing the content? Like what is the lenses that you put on the current content, and like where to go from here? Like what are you auditing?
The answer to this depends on many things, and this is where you put your strategist hat on. With your strategist hat on, your main goal is to ask why. Start from why. So why is content being done? What are people hoping to achieve? What are the goals of the business? What is the problem or the challenge that content is helping the business with? That dictates your next step, because you can't possibly audit everything. So maybe sometimes you come in and there's 10 pieces of content and you can. Some other times you've inherited a monster of 1,000 pages and you can't possibly do everything. So you need to narrow down the reason why you're doing an audit in the first place. And then, so if you start with why, then you can use that as your guiding principle to take an inventory. For example, if your goal is growing SEO traffic for whatever reason, then you can ignore all the content on your social channels. You can ignore your newsletter for the time being, and you can just run a crawl of your site or use a tool like Ahrefs, I suppose, to see where you're at. So your goal dictates the kind of inventory that you take. If, and depending on what kind of system you got in place, you can bring in some performance data, so you can check traffic in Google Analytics or whichever success metrics you track. For example, I don't know, last touch signups, MQLs, whatever. If the answer is nothing is being tracked, that's fine, because you're still the content lead and you have a strategy hat on. So your next action on the job might actually be figuring out a meaningful way to decide what success is. Mm-hmm. And only here, and only at this point, you then know what to do with the content. So you put all this data into a spreadsheet, whatever method you're using, and now you look at how things are performing and you decide essentially what to keep and keep it as it is, what to optimize, edit, change, and what to get rid of, which might mean redirect some pieces or just delete them off the face of the earth. And then you can make a plan, you can execute, and you iterate. And just because you're the lead on a new team doesn't mean that you do this once and then it's forgotten. You might end up doing this multiple times in your career at the same company, especially if you produce a lot of content. It's always a good time, maybe every year, to sit back, look at what you've done, see what can be improved, and take it from there.
How does user research play into it when you are, I guess, starting a new role? I don't know, like in your estimation, like how many of the content teams that you kind of get in touch with, I don't know, through your freelance or to contractor work or through the companies you actually worked at, is content research being or customer research being done for content specifically, especially from a strategic point of view? Like, I mean, as you just said, like maybe even once every 6 months or once a year to actually define what kind of content you are going to produce. Like, how does that, like, let's say you've done the audit and you know what's there, like then from there on, like you might have an inclination of what worked in the past. What kind of, if you would have to do content research, what kind of content research would you do?
Interesting, and not something I've actually practically thought about. Like in my mind, when I rule the world of marketing, I will make customer research for marketing teams mandatory at least once a week. So you should, as a marketer, be on a Zoom call with a customer once a week, because that just keeps you in line with what's happening. When it comes to content, you can probably use some of these calls to ask for feedback on the content you've created, or you can try to find other ways to measure it. So for example, I mentioned HotJar. We had a survey on the blog, and we just simply asked questions about whether people were finding what they were looking for, and if not, what was it they were looking for. And they I don't remember how we worded the question, but did they find the article useful? Yes or no, thumbs up. And you could collect some sort of quantitative data about it. I think it was, did you find the article useful? Yes or no. And if no, you would then have a question that said, what was the problem with it? So actually that helped you optimize the content there, because maybe they came for a specific reason, they couldn't find it. That's great. Even if you have just one person telling you that something wasn't working, you can just go and edit. That's part of your iterative approach to content. You might not pick any of this up in your audit. Like your audit might just tell you that things are good, but you're not hearing it from the point of view of the humans. So you can see the numbers, you can see the traffic, you can see the conversions, but if you can pair it with some sort of qualitative data in whichever way it is, a non-intrusive survey, customer calls, you can even just, if you don't have resources or time, just go on Twitter, see if anybody's talking about your product or your content at all. Somebody might have said something at some point. Any kind of information, any kind of signal that comes your way, I think helps you be a more informed marketer and therefore make better choices for your customers. But yeah, when I rule the world of marketing, we're all going to have a customer call every week. So be prepared.
Actually, it's something that I have only implemented later as well, for kind of automating some of the feedback gathering, right? Like you have the qualitative interviews that you're doing, but you can also just like even in a newsletter, if someone has opened it 10 times, like maybe send out like a little survey of like 3 questions, like, hey, what did you like, stuff like that, or have it on the website. All these kind of data points help steer the direction that is away from opinions and towards more like what the customer actually wants to read. Cool. Well, I think like that leaves us with, you have like one opportunity to speak to marketing leaders who are mostly part of this audience here that are listening in here, and they lead content teams. Like, how can marketing leaders empower their content teams?
You brought the big question at the end. I was getting comfortable. I think if you're a marketing lead, you already know and believe in the power of content. So in addition to empowering your team from the top down, you actually need to fight for them towards the higher up. There is a lot of, well, there isn't a lot, but there is the occasional misunderstanding of what content does and lack of alignment with the C-suite and the VP level. And if you are in a leadership position, advocate for it, fight for it, because you can prove the ROI. It is a valuable growth lever for the business. There is enough evidence everywhere. Convince the people who are not convinced about it, and then empower your team to do research, talk to customers, be truly customer-centric, try new things and break things and do new things. That's your role as a marketing lead, I think.
Love that. And I think that's a good message to put out there. Also kind of, I don't know, not having like executives breathe down the neck of content marketers. Like, hopefully you hire people who know what they're doing and kind of executing a strategy. So you as a leader can kind of take that pressure away and direct it towards you or somewhere else, or towards numbers. I love that message. Cool. So where can people find you online? We mentioned the newsletter.
Yes.
So say that again.
So that's contentfolks.substack.com. Mm-hmm. I have the beautiful Twitter handle of Content 101, but I'm terrible on Twitter. So if you ping me, I will reply, but I'm just not there anyway. But I just like to say that I have Content 101. So that's where I'm at. But yeah, mostly Content Folks. And if you subscribe to it, or if you just send me an email via it, I always reply. I make a point of replying to everything that comes my way from the newsletter. So I will get back to anybody who wants to talk to me.
And I can vouch for the newsletter. That's kind of how I know you through Louis somehow. I think at some point he mentioned you on LinkedIn or something like that. And then I subscribed to your newsletter, and that's kind of how you landed on this podcast, because it's just really valuable. So go and subscribe to that. Yeah, it was a pleasure having you on the podcast, Fio. And
likewise,
I hope to receive many more of your newsletters, and I see you online.
I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Bye, Fio. Thank you.